In a classroom that should foster growth and learning, one racist teacher with a deep-seated prejudice creates an atmosphere filled with tension and hidden biases. Mrs. Grant, known for her strictness, carries a biased and racist outlook that's about to be challenged in a way no one expected. What happens next will shatter everything you thought you believed about fairness, justice, and the power of hidden allies. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if this powerful story of bravery and honesty resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more inspiring stories. The first bell of the school year echoed through the halls of Glenwood High. Sunlight poured through the windows and students gathered in groups, chatting, laughing, and catching up. Walking through this busy crowd was Aaliyah Johnson, a new student. Aaliyah was quiet but confident. Her dark skin and curly hair gave her a warm glow as she held her worn leather journal. This school was a fresh start for her, and she hoped it would be a place where she could belong. In her English class, Aaliyah noticed Mrs. Grant, the teacher, standing at the front with her hair pulled back tightly. Mrs. Grant was known for being strict and serious, and her eyes stayed on Aaliyah a little longer than the other students. When the bell rang, Mrs. Grant cleared her throat and spoke firmly to the class. "Good morning, class. I'm Mrs. Grant, and I will be your English teacher this year. I have high expectations for each of you," she said, her voice cool, steady, and with an aura of authority. "In this class, we will learn to think critically, to analyze literature, and most importantly, to express ourselves with clarity and respect. I don't tolerate mediocrity." Aaliyah listened closely, but there was something cold in Mrs. Grant's tone that she couldn't shake. She shrugged it off, hoping it was just nerves on the first day. But things didn't get easier. Class began with an introduction to the year's syllabus, and Mrs. Grant wasted no time diving into a discussion on the first text, To Kill a Mockingbird. She called on students randomly, testing their opinions on the book's themes of justice and moral courage. When she looked in Aaliyah's direction, her eyes held a scrutinizing look. "Aaliyah Johnson, correct?" Mrs. Grant's voice sliced through the class's quiet hum. Aaliyah nodded, her heart skipping slightly at the abruptness. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Grant's gaze narrowed, assessing. "What do you think Harper Lee was trying to convey about empathy in the book? Do you believe Atticus Finch was justified in defending Tom Robinson despite the town's sentiments?" Aaliyah took a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had read To Kill a Mockingbird before and felt deeply about its themes. "I think Atticus did what he thought was right," she began, her voice soft but firm. "He stood up for someone who was unfairly judged because of their skin color. To me, that's an act of real courage, of empathy. He was willing to go against the crowd because he believed in justice." Mrs. Grant's mouth tightened almost immediately. "Interesting," she said with a touch of restraint, though her tone was faintly dismissive. "But don't you think empathy should be balanced with pragmatism? Idealism has its place, but we can't ignore the consequences." Aaliyah felt a subtle wave of discomfort. She wanted to counter, to explain her thoughts more deeply, but Mrs. Grant had already shifted her gaze to another student, effectively ending the exchange. Aaliyah sat back, feeling a strange prick of disappointment, a flicker of doubt gnawing at her initial confidence. Throughout the week, these interactions became routine. Mrs. Grant would call on Aaliyah in discussions, pressing her to elaborate in ways that felt almost confrontational. She'd make comments on Aaliyah's responses that, while not overtly critical, carried an undertone that made Aaliyah feel as though her answers were never quite good enough. Meanwhile, Aaliyah found peace in the friendships she was beginning to build. There was Lucas, a bright, witty boy with a knack for spinning humor into every conversation, and Maya, a spirited girl with a contagious feeling when she laughed. They sat together during lunch, swapping stories about family, classes, and dreams, slowly piecing together a circle of warmth that buffered Aaliyah against the chill she felt in Mrs. Grant's classroom. One day, as they lounged under the oak tree on the edge of the school courtyard, Lucas turned to Aaliyah, his face thoughtful. "So, what's up with Mrs. Grant?" he asked, voice lowered. "She's been extra hard on you. Did you do something to get on her bad side?" Aaliyah looked down, tracing patterns in the grass with her finger. "I don't know. I mean, I try my best, but it feels like nothing I say is right. Maybe she just doesn't like new students." Maya shook her head. "It's weird. I've had her for English before, and yeah, she's strict, but this seems different." She paused, glancing at Aaliyah with a hesitant expression. "You think it's because, you know." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. She understood the unspoken implication but wasn't ready to give voice to it. "Maybe," she replied quietly, pushing back the frustration that was beginning to build up within her. Back in class, Mrs. Grant's scrutiny grew more persistent. She began grading Aaliyah's essays with a meticulousness that bordered on harshness. Every red mark on her assignments felt like a jab, each circled word or underlined phrase a message that Aaliyah's best wasn't enough. Aaliyah put in extra hours, rereading texts, revising her work. Yet each time her paper was returned, Mrs. Grant found some minor flaw, something to point out as if proving a silent point. The weight of it began to wear on Aaliyah, though she tried not to let it show. She'd grown up learning resilience, valuing hard work, and believing that effort would always be rewarded. But here, in Mrs. Grant's class, it felt like there was a wall she couldn't quite scale, an invisible barrier that wouldn't budge no matter how high she reached. Then came the group project. Mrs. Grant assigned them to analyze The Great Gatsby, and when she announced the groups, Aaliyah's name was paired with two students known for their academic prowess, Jonathan and Rebecca. Mrs. Grant's face betrayed a hint of satisfaction as she read the names aloud, a subtle nod that seemed to say she was giving Aaliyah a chance to prove herself. As they gathered after class to discuss the project, Jonathan looked at Aaliyah with raised eyebrows. "Guess we've got the honor student with us. Mrs. Grant seems to think you'll keep us in check." Aaliyah forced a smile, though she felt the sting of his words. "Yeah, I'll do my best." Over the next week, Aaliyah poured herself into the project, determined to prove her worth not only to herself, but to Mrs. Grant. She researched, outlined, and drafted her sections with care, hoping that her efforts would finally be enough to garner some form of acknowledgement. When the day of the presentations arrived, Mrs. Grant observed each group with her usual steely expression. As Aaliyah stood before the class, her voice clear and steady as she presented her analysis, she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Grant's face. The teacher's eyes were unreadable, her expression as closed off as ever. As the bell rang and the class filed out, Aaliyah felt a familiar pang of frustration, the sense that no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough. In the hall, Lucas fell in step beside her, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Hey," he said softly, his tone gentle. "Don't let her get to you. You're amazing, and we all see it. She's the one with the problem, not you." Aaliyah offered him a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Lucas. I just don't get why she seems to have it out for me." He shrugged, but his gaze was serious. "Maybe it's something she needs to figure out for herself. Don't let it change you." As Aaliyah walked toward her next class, her thoughts remained tangled, the weight of Mrs. Grant's judgment pressing down on her. Yet somewhere within, a spark of determination kindled, the first stirrings of a resolve to stand tall, even in the face of silent resistance. The following week slipped by in a series of restless nights and relentless days, each one bringing Aaliyah back into room 203 with a sense of dread she hadn't felt in any classroom before. She still clutched her journal each day, its pages slowly filling with the thoughts and questions she didn't dare voice out loud. Mrs. Grant, it seemed, was always watching, always judging, her eyes sharp, like she was waiting for Aaliyah to slip up, to reveal some flaw. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted subtly with every passing day. Mrs. Grant's interactions with Aaliyah were becoming more pointed, her corrections more biting. It was never outright. There was no shouting, no harsh reprimands. Instead, it was a series of small gestures, quiet comments that cut deeper than words shouted in anger. She would circle an unnecessary number of words on Aaliyah's essays, her red pen leaving marks like wounds on the page. She'd single her out in class discussions, asking her to elaborate on ideas she had already explained, almost as if pushing her, testing her patience. One afternoon, Mrs. Grant announced a pop quiz on their current reading, The Great Gatsby. As soon as she handed out the sheets, Aaliyah's stomach tightened. She knew the material well. She had stayed up late, studying every line. But something about the way Mrs. Grant watched her made her fingers shake as she picked up her pen. "All right," Mrs. Grant said, her voice smooth and composed. "I expect nothing less than your best. This quiz will measure not only your memory, but your understanding of the themes and characters. Good luck." The silence in the room was thick as the students bent over their papers. Aaliyah could feel Mrs. Grant's gaze on her, cold and unyielding, as if she were willing her to make a mistake. Aaliyah's thoughts tangled, the words on the page blurring. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus, to ignore the weight pressing down on her chest. After the quiz, Aaliyah walked out of the classroom with Lucas and Maya by her side. They had become her safe space, their laughter and understanding a balm to the wounds that Mrs. Grant's quiet hostility left behind. "Hey," Lucas nudged her, sensing her tension. "You okay? You looked a little lost in there." Aaliyah managed a small smile. I don't know. I studied, but I feel like I'll never be enough in her eyes." Maya sighed, her expression thoughtful. "It's like she has this invisible measuring stick, and no matter how hard you try, it's always out of reach." Aaliyah nodded. She had always worked hard, always strived to excel, but in Mrs. Grant's class, her best felt like it dissolved under the woman's gaze. The self-doubt Mrs. Grant planted in her was growing, creeping into her mind like an unwelcome shadow. The results of the quiz came the next day. Mrs. Grant handed back the papers one by one, her expression impassive as she scanned each student's work. When she placed Aaliyah's quiz on her desk, her lips tightened. "Disappointing," she murmured, her voice low but sharp enough for Aaliyah to feel the sting. "I expected more." Aaliyah looked down at the red-inked score circled at the top of her paper. She had passed, but barely, and the sight of that harsh red mark brought a painful lump to her throat. She wanted to argue, to tell Mrs. Grant that she had studied, that she had given her all, but the words remained trapped behind her lips, weighed down by the fear of disrespecting her teacher. She carried that frustration with her to the courtyard, where Lucas and Maya were waiting. Lucas's easy smile faded when he saw her expression. "Let me guess," he said, glancing at the paper clutched in her hand. "Mrs. Grant?" Aaliyah nodded, feeling the familiar burn of embarrassment and anger mixed together. She basically said I wasn't good enough. Again." Lucas clenched his fists, his voice filled with the kind of quiet outrage that made Aaliyah feel a little less alone. "This is ridiculous. You know this isn't about your work, right?" Maya placed a comforting hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. "Maybe you should talk to someone about it. A counselor, maybe? Someone who can help." Aaliyah's instinct was to brush off the suggestion. She didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to be seen as the student who couldn't handle a little criticism. But a part of her, a part that was growing louder, knew that this wasn't just about criticism. This was something deeper, something that cut to the core of who she was. The tension reached a boiling point during their next class presentation. Mrs. Grant had assigned them each to analyze a different symbol from The Great Gatsby, and Aaliyah, despite her nervousness, had put her heart into her research. She crafted a thoughtful presentation on the green light, speaking passionately about its representation of unattainable dreams and the complexities of hope. When she finished, a few students clapped softly, and Aaliyah felt a flicker of pride. But Mrs. Grant's face was impassive, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you, Aaliyah," Mrs. Grant said, her tone so cold it made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "Your interpretation was interesting, though I would caution you to be more objective in your analysis. Literature is not simply about personal emotion. It's about universal truths." Aaliyah felt the ground shift beneath her, her sense of accomplishment deflating. She opened her mouth to respond, to explain her point of view, but Mrs. Grant had already turned to call on the next student, her dismissal stinging more than any critique could. As Aaliyah took her seat, a quiet determination settled over her. She realized that Mrs. Grant would never see her as good enough, no matter how hard she tried. But if she couldn't gain her teacher's approval, then maybe she could find her own path to confidence, to self-worth. Later that evening, Aaliyah sat at her bedroom desk, staring at the open pages of her journal. She began to write, pouring her feelings into words that felt raw and powerful. She wrote about the frustration, the constant feeling of being watched, of being judged, of feeling like she was wearing invisible chains in that classroom. Each line of ink became a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of her worth that no one could take from her. As the weeks wore on, Aaliyah found herself increasingly isolated within room 203, each day a struggle between her desire to excel and the painful awareness that her efforts would likely go unrecognized. Mrs. Grant's small criticisms continued, and each one felt like a stone in her chest, heavy and suffocating. It all came to a head one rainy afternoon when the class was tasked with another timed essay on The Great Gatsby. Mrs. Grant's instructions were brief, her tone curt as she emphasized the importance of a strong thesis. Aaliyah's pen trembled in her hand as she wrote, the ticking clock adding pressure as Mrs. Grant paced slowly down the rows. Midway through, Mrs. Grant stopped beside Aaliyah's desk, glancing down at her paper with a faint frown. She didn't say a word, but her silence was enough to shatter Aaliyah's concentration, to fill her with a suffocating self-doubt that made it impossible to continue. The minutes slipped by, each one heavier than the last, until Mrs. Grant finally moved on, leaving Aaliyah to struggle through the final lines of her essay. When the bell rang, Aaliyah handed in her paper with a sinking heart, already bracing for the inevitable red marks, the silent reminder that nothing she did was good enough. She walked out of the classroom feeling drained, her usual resilience taken away by the constant weight of Mrs. Grant's judgment. In the days that followed, the tension between them grew unbearable. Aaliyah's work was returned with harsher marks, her efforts ignored, her words minimized. Each small slight fed her frustration, and soon the doubt that had taken root in her heart began to grow into anger, a quiet, simmering rage that she had no outlet for. Lucas and Maya noticed the change, the way Aaliyah's laughter came less easily, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of unspoken words. They tried to support her, to remind her of her worth, but even their friendship couldn't shield her from the constant judgment she faced each day. One afternoon, as Aaliyah sat alone under the oak tree, her journal open on her lap, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, her heart aching with the quiet pain of feeling invisible, unvalued, unworthy. She clenched her fists, feeling the frustration build until it became an almost unbearable pressure, the desire to fight back clashing with the fear of drawing even more criticism. But in that quiet moment, a thought crept into her mind, a small flicker of realization that filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. If Mrs. Grant wanted to break her spirit, then perhaps the real challenge wasn't trying to win her approval. Maybe the test was something different, learning to believe in herself, even in the face of someone else's judgment. As Aaliyah sat under the oak tree, this revelation rooted itself in her heart, settling alongside the frustration and anger. She could feel the shift within her, small but powerful, like the first flicker of a flame. It wasn't a grand epiphany. She didn't suddenly feel free from all doubt. But there was a growing strength, a quiet defiance that whispered she was more than Mrs. Grant's opinions. The following day, she walked into room 203 with her chin a little higher, her shoulders squared, and a steady look in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She would not hide or shrink under Mrs. Grant's gaze, no matter how sharp it felt. She would do her work, speak her mind, and let the judgment roll off her like raindrops. As class began, Mrs. Grant gave them a new assignment, a personal reflection on resilience, inspired by the challenges faced by Gatsby's characters. Aaliyah's pulse quickened as she listened, the irony not lost on her. It was as if fate had set this assignment in front of her as an invitation to pour out all the strength and clarity she had found beneath the oak tree. The room grew silent as everyone began to write. Aaliyah gripped her pen, her thoughts pouring onto the page like a free-flowing river. Her reflection wasn't about Gatsby or Daisy. It was about her own story, her own resilience in the face of judgment and doubt. She didn't name names or point fingers, but each word she wrote was a reflection of her quiet battle in that classroom. She finished the piece with a deep sense of relief, feeling as if she'd finally allowed herself to speak her truth, even if it was only on paper. When Mrs. Grant collected the papers, her expression remained as impassive as ever. Aaliyah watched her walk away with the stack of reflections, feeling a strange sense of peace. For once, it didn't matter what grade or comment she would receive. Her words held a strength that couldn't be erased with red ink. The next morning, Mrs. Grant stood at the front of the classroom, holding the stack of reflections. "I'd like to read one of these aloud," she announced, her gaze sweeping over the class. Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized her handwriting at the top of the page Mrs. Grant was holding. Mrs. Grant began to read, her voice steady and cool, each word echoing through the room. Aaliyah felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her soul had been laid bare before everyone. But as Mrs. Grant read on, Aaliyah noticed something she hadn't expected. The faintest flicker of emotion in her teacher's eyes. A subtle shift in her expression. For the first time, Mrs. Grant's gaze softened, if only for a moment, and when she finished reading, there was a quiet pause in the room. "That was well written," Mrs. Grant finally said, her voice almost begrudging. "It shows a level of maturity and insight I hadn't expected." Aaliyah met her teacher's gaze, a spark of confidence flickering within her. She didn't need Mrs. Grant's approval anymore, but hearing those words, seeing even a sliver of respect, felt like a small victory, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the storm. As the bell rang and the students gathered their things, Lucas nudged her with a grin. "That was amazing, Aaliyah. You actually got her to say something nice." Aaliyah smiled, the warmth of their support filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was standing up for everyone who had ever felt invisible, who had ever struggled to be seen. And though she knew the battle wasn't over, she walked out of that classroom with a new sense of strength, ready to face whatever came next. The next few weeks in room 203 felt like navigating a battlefield, where the air was charged with unspoken words and palpable tension. Aaliyah noticed subtle changes in Mrs. Grant's behavior. Small, almost imperceptible shifts that, to most, might go unnoticed. But Aaliyah had learned to read between the lines, to pick up on the way Mrs. Grant's gaze would linger just a beat too long, the way her praise was sometimes veiled with the slightest hint of reluctance. There was an incident that brought this awareness sharply into focus. The class was discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, a novel that held a mirror to issues of race, justice, and the tension between societal expectations and personal morality. Mrs. Grant stood before the class, her expression unreadable as she posed a question. Who here can relate to Scout's sense of confusion over why society judges people based on things beyond their control? Aaliyah's hand went up, joined by a few others. Mrs. Grant called on a classmate, who gave a well-rehearsed answer about empathy and understanding others' perspectives. But then Mrs. Grant's gaze shifted to Aaliyah, her eyebrows slightly raised as if daring her to speak. "Your thoughts, Aaliyah?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to make Aaliyah hesitate. But she held her ground, meeting her teacher's gaze. "I think Scout's confusion comes from the innocence of youth," Aaliyah said carefully, each word deliberate. "She doesn't understand why people judge others based on skin color because she hasn't been taught that prejudice yet. It's heartbreaking, really, to see someone so young forced to confront that kind of hate." Mrs. Grant's lips pressed into a thin line. "So you're saying prejudice is taught?" Aaliyah nodded. "Yes, I think it's learned behavior. People aren't born with it. They learn it from the world around them, from the people they look up to." A subtle tension filled the room as Mrs. Grant's gaze hardened, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond, simply turned back to the board with a stiff nod, dismissing Aaliyah's words without acknowledgement. It was as if she couldn't bear to entertain the truth of what Aaliyah was saying, as if her very worldview was being challenged in ways she wasn't prepared to confront. The classroom returned to a quiet hum, but Aaliyah felt the weight of Mrs. Grant's dismissal pressing down on her, like a cold shadow that clung to her thoughts long after the class had ended. It was becoming clearer to her that Mrs. Grant's resentment wasn't just about academics or classroom dynamics. It was something deeper, something embedded within her that resisted change, that held onto old, ingrained beliefs. Later that week, the school held a debate competition, one that had been the talk of the entire campus for weeks. It was a big deal. Students from each grade were selected to represent their class, and the topics always focused on real-world issues that required not just knowledge, but a genuine understanding of the complexities of society. Aaliyah was one of the representatives for her class, along with Lucas and a girl named Sarah, who was known for her quick wit and persuasive arguments. The topic: does systemic prejudice still influence our society? It felt almost surreal to Aaliyah. She stood there, prepared to discuss something that she experienced firsthand in Mrs. Grant's classroom, something she saw echoed in the world around her. As she delivered her arguments, her voice grew stronger, her words fueled by a passion that made the audience sit up and listen. When it was Mrs. Grant's turn to evaluate the teams, Aaliyah could feel her gaze like a heavy weight pressing down on her. Mrs. Grant delivered her critique with a carefully measured tone, praising Lucas and Sarah for their points while giving only the faintest acknowledgement to Aaliyah's arguments. Her words were polite, but there was a coldness beneath them, a reluctance to recognize Aaliyah's efforts that spoke volumes. But Aaliyah didn't let it shake her. The audience's applause, the encouragement from her friends, all reaffirmed that her voice mattered, that she was capable of standing on her own, no matter who tried to silence her. The weekend came, bringing with it a welcome break from the daily grind of school. But Mrs. Grant's presence lingered in Aaliyah's mind. Her mother noticed the tension and finally sat her down for a heart-to-heart, one of those rare, grounding talks that Aaliyah had always treasured. Her mom's voice was warm, her words woven with wisdom and strength, the kind of quiet resilience that Aaliyah was beginning to realize had been passed down to her. "You know, Aaliyah," her mother began, "people carry their own histories, their own pains, whether they acknowledge them or not. Sometimes when people are unkind, it's not because of you. It's because of something within them they haven't dealt with." Aaliyah listened, letting the words sink in, feeling a strange comfort in knowing that her mother understood that she wasn't alone in navigating these complex emotions. "Don't let anyone take away the light that's inside you," her mother continued, her gaze warm but firm. "People will try, consciously or unconsciously, to bring you down, to make you question yourself. But remember who you are. Hold on to that." Aaliyah nodded, feeling a renewed strength settle within her. She could face whatever came her way, and she wouldn't let Mrs. Grant's judgments define her. The following Monday, Aaliyah walked into room 203 with a quiet resolve. She was no longer afraid of Mrs. Grant's disapproval. She had learned to stand firm in her own truth, to trust her own voice. The lesson that day was on writing and analysis, and as Mrs. Grant walked around the room, observing everyone's work, she paused by Aaliyah's desk. For a moment they locked eyes, and Aaliyah could see a flicker of something in her teacher's gaze, a mix of frustration, resentment, and perhaps a grudging respect. Mrs. Grant cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Aaliyah, your analysis is decent, though I think you're missing some key insights." Aaliyah smiled, a calm, knowing smile. "Thank you for your feedback, Mrs. Grant. I'll look into it." The moment passed, and Aaliyah felt a sense of triumph. She didn't need her teacher's approval to know she was doing well. She had her mother's words, her friends' support, and most importantly, her own belief in herself. As the day drew to a close, Aaliyah lingered by the door, watching as Mrs. Grant packed up her things. There was a part of her that wanted to understand, to know what had hardened her teacher's heart, what had built this wall between them. But she also knew that some things couldn't be explained, that some people's wounds ran too deep to be healed by a single conversation. With one last glance, Aaliyah turned and walked away, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The battle wasn't over, but she was no longer fighting alone. She had found her own strength, her own voice, and that was something no one could take from her. Aaliyah stepped into Mrs. Grant's classroom on Monday morning with a newfound confidence. The events of the previous weeks had been transformative. Each experience seemed to fortify her sense of self and her understanding of the world. She no longer felt the need to prove her worth to Mrs. Grant or seek validation from her. Still, as the lesson unfolded, Aaliyah remained aware of her teacher's subtle but constant gaze, as if Mrs. Grant was still waiting for her to falter, to slip up. The day's assignment was a group project, an in-depth study on modern civil rights movements. Mrs. Grant divided the class into groups, and unsurprisingly, she placed Aaliyah with a set of students she clearly deemed more motivated than the rest. These were the class's high achievers, students who rarely interacted with Aaliyah, some of whom likely shared Mrs. Grant's perceptions, or at the very least, were influenced by her tone and approach. Mrs. Grant walked to the front of the class, her voice stern as she laid down the project's expectations. "Each of you will contribute equally to your group's success," she announced, her gaze falling on Aaliyah with the slightest glint of challenge. "I expect high-quality work, and it will be obvious who does and who does not pull their weight." Aaliyah could feel the weight of her words, knowing full well they were meant as a warning. Her group members, including a girl named Elise and a boy named Ryan, both known for their ambition and high grades, shot her wary glances. Aaliyah met their eyes with a quiet determination. She wouldn't let Mrs. Grant's assumptions affect her performance or diminish her contributions. The days that followed were tense but productive. Aaliyah worked tirelessly, going above and beyond to ensure her part of the project was thorough and insightful. She researched late into the night, gathering statistics, historical comparisons, and even personal stories from family members who had experienced the struggles of fighting for equality. Her work wasn't just driven by the desire for a grade, it was personal, a chance to honor her heritage and the strength of her community. When the presentation day arrived, Aaliyah stepped up with her group, prepared to showcase her work. Her voice was steady, her words articulate as she wove together facts with emotion, giving a powerful account of the modern civil rights movement. Her classmates listened intently, many visibly moved by her presentation, nodding along as she spoke. But as the applause filled the room, Mrs. Grant's expression remained stoic, her lips pressed tightly together. She nodded once, a stiff, barely there acknowledgement of the group's effort. "Good work," she said, her voice cool. "However, I noticed that some sections of the presentation lacked depth." The subtle jab was directed at Aaliyah, though she had been the driving force behind most of the research and writing. Aaliyah stood in silence, feeling the sting of Mrs. Grant's words, but refusing to let it show on her face. She had expected this, after all. She knew by now that no matter how hard she tried, Mrs. Grant's perception of her was firmly cemented. The following week, the school hosted a parent-teacher meeting, an event that drew families from every background to discuss their children's progress. Aaliyah's parents attended each year, always eager to stay involved and support their daughter's education. But this year felt different for Aaliyah. She was filled with a mixture of anxiety and defiance, wondering what Mrs. Grant would say about her in front of her parents. Unknown to Aaliyah, Mrs. Grant had no idea that her father, Principal Johnson, was her parent. It was an oversight that revealed the teacher's inability to see beyond her own assumptions. In Mrs. Grant's eyes, Aaliyah was simply a challenging student, someone whose spirit she felt the need to tame. As Principal Johnson entered the room with Aaliyah's mother, he observed the way Mrs. Grant's expression shifted when she saw him. There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of nervousness that crossed her face before she regained her composure. She greeted him politely with a respect that had been noticeably absent in her interactions with Aaliyah. During their conversation, Mrs. Grant recounted her version of Aaliyah's behavior in the classroom, her voice filled with condescending undertones. She spoke of Aaliyah's lack of respect and her troublesome attitude, weaving a narrative that painted Aaliyah as difficult, rather than as a determined and capable student. Her comments were vague enough to sound professional, yet they were filled with implications that Aaliyah's father couldn't ignore. Principal Johnson listened, his expression unreadable, nodding occasionally but remaining silent. Mrs. Grant, mistaking his silence for agreement, continued, her tone growing more emboldened. She spoke of Aaliyah's so-called attitude, her difficulty in accepting guidance, and her overly independent nature. The insinuations were clear. She saw Aaliyah's confidence as defiance, her intelligence as arrogance. Aaliyah's mother sat beside her husband, her hand resting calmly on her lap, but there was a spark of indignation in her eyes. She watched Mrs. Grant, her gaze unwavering, absorbing each word, each veiled insult with a quiet, simmering anger. Mrs. Grant continued, oblivious to the fact that her words were being scrutinized by two people who knew Aaliyah better than anyone else. She was so caught up in her own narrative that she failed to notice the tension building between her and the principal. It was only when she mentioned Aaliyah's lack of respect for authority figures that Principal Johnson's calm facade shifted, his jaw tightening slightly. Mrs. Grant, he said, his voice measured but firm. Respect is something that should be mutual, don't you think? Mrs. Grant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't anticipated this response, and for a moment she faltered, her composed exterior cracking. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. "But some students need more guidance in understanding that." Principal Johnson nodded, his expression unreadable once more. He thanked her for her feedback, a polite smile playing on his lips as he and his wife stood to leave. Mrs. Grant watched them go, a faint sense of unease settling over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something, that there was more to this conversation than she realized. Over the next few days, Mrs. Grant found herself increasingly uncomfortable. She had begun to notice things she hadn't before. Aaliyah's last name, the resemblance she shared with Principal Johnson. It was like putting together the pieces of a puzzle that had been in front of her all along, but had somehow eluded her notice. Late one evening, as she was grading papers alone in her classroom, the realization finally struck her. The pieces clicked into place, and with a sickening jolt she understood. Aaliyah was Principal Johnson's daughter. All this time she had been treating the child of her superior with an unfairness that now felt very obvious, even to her. A wave of anxiety washed over Mrs. Grant as she recalled every interaction, every harsh word and dismissive look she had directed at Aaliyah. Her actions had not gone unnoticed. They had been observed by the one person who had the power to hold her accountable. But more than fear, a deeper feeling stirred within her, a sense of shame, of unease that pricked at her conscience. She could no longer ignore the uncomfortable truth that had been lurking in the background all along. She had failed Aaliyah not just as a teacher but as a person. For the first time, Mrs. Grant was forced to confront the biases that had influenced her actions, the prejudice she had allowed to cloud her judgment. It was a realization that left her feeling exposed, vulnerable, as if the very foundation of her identity had been called into question. As the night wore on, Mrs. Grant sat alone in the empty classroom, her thoughts a blend of regret and self-reflection. She knew there was no easy way forward, no simple solution to the complex web of mistakes she had made. But one thing was certain. The events of the past few weeks had irrevocably changed her, forcing her to confront the darker parts of herself that she had long ignored. The day began like any other, with students filing into Mrs. Grant's classroom, chatting, laughing, and settling into their seats. Aaliyah, however, was quiet. The unease that had been building inside her over the past weeks was harder to ignore today. She could feel the invisible weight of every past slight, every dismissive look, and every unkind word spoken by Mrs. Grant gathering around her. It had all been bottled up, contained, waiting for a moment she knew was bound to come. As Mrs. Grant began the lesson, her eyes swept across the room and landed on Aaliyah. There was a flicker of something, perhaps regret, maybe discomfort, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She continued with the day's lesson, but it wasn't long before the familiar biting undertone crept into her words. "Aaliyah," she called out, her voice carrying an edge that caught everyone's attention. "I'm sure you've had time to go over the reading materials. Do you have any thoughts to share?" Aaliyah looked up, feeling the familiar tension tightening around her. She knew this wasn't a genuine invitation to contribute. It was a test, a challenge. Mrs. Grant was waiting for her to stumble, to fall short. Clearing her throat, Aaliyah spoke up, her voice steady but soft. "Yes, I actually found it interesting how the text talks about the strength people find in their communities when they feel marginalized." Mrs. Grant's lips twisted into a faint, condescending smile. "Strength in communities, yes, but I would think some people need a bit more personal discipline and respect before they can even think about something so abstract." A few students exchanged glances, a murmur of discomfort spreading through the room. Mrs. Grant's comment was not subtle, and everyone could sense the sting in her words. Aaliyah's cheeks flushed, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd grown used to brushing these moments off, swallowing her pride and keeping her head down, but today the weight felt heavier, harder to bear. Before she could respond, one of her classmates, a girl named Maya, spoke up. "That's not fair, Mrs. Grant," she said, her tone firm but respectful. "Aaliyah's been doing great work. We've all seen it." Mrs. Grant's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she turned her attention to Maya. "This is not about fairness, Maya," she replied, her voice crisp. "It's about having a strong foundation of discipline. That's something some students need to work harder on." Aaliyah's hands clenched under her desk. She could feel the wave of emotions rising within her. Anger, frustration, a sense of injustice that was impossible to ignore. She was tired of being treated as though her efforts were never good enough, as though she was constantly failing some invisible test. One by one, her classmates began to speak up, each voice carrying a note of quiet rebellion, a refusal to let Mrs. Grant's words go unchallenged. "Aaliyah's done nothing wrong," Ryan said, his voice low but firm. "She's one of the smartest people here." Mrs. Grant's face flushed, her authority visibly shaken as her own students pushed back, unwilling to stand by silently. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on each student with a look of disbelief. This was her class, her domain. She was supposed to have control, to command respect. But now, her words seemed to hang in the air, brittle and exposed. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the classroom opened, and a familiar figure stepped in. Principal Johnson stood at the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Mrs. Grant. The students fell silent, their heads turning toward the principal with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. The atmosphere was thick with the tension of the moment, each second stretching on as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Principal Johnson's expression was calm, but there was a steely glint in his eyes that hinted at something deeper. He had heard enough. This wasn't just another routine visit to observe a classroom. He had come with a purpose, and he was about to make it known. "Good morning, Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear the discussion in here. It seems there's a lot on everyone's minds today." Mrs. Grant stiffened, her posture rigid as she turned to face him. Her cheeks were flushed and there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Principal Johnson," she said, forcing a polite smile. "We were just discussing some aspects of the lesson." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I see. It's always important for students to feel encouraged and respected. Wouldn't you agree?" There was a pause, a loaded silence that filled the room as Mrs. Grant realized the full weight of his words. She could feel her students' eyes on her, their expressions a mixture of hope and vindication. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Principal Johnson continued, his tone steady but unyielding. "I think it's time we address something that's been happening here for far too long," he said, his gaze shifting to Aaliyah, who sat silently, her hands clenched in her lap. "This is not just about teaching. It's about the way we treat one another. Aaliyah deserves the same respect as every other student in this classroom." The truth of his words hung in the air, undeniable and powerful. Mrs. Grant's face paled, the realization finally sinking in. She had been treating the principal's daughter with a level of disdain that she would never have dared to show any other student. And now, standing before her was the man who had witnessed it all, who had silently observed her actions and was now ready to hold her accountable. Principal Johnson's gaze never wavered, his expression a blend of disappointment and resolve. He looked around at the students, acknowledging their courage in standing up for their classmate, before turning back to Mrs. Grant. "May I speak with you in private, Mrs. Grant?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for refusal. The room was silent as she followed him out, her footsteps heavy with the weight of the confrontation that awaited her. The students sat in stunned silence, the impact of what they had just witnessed settling over them like a quiet storm. Aaliyah remained at her desk, her heart pounding, a sense of relief and validation washing over her. She didn't know what her father would say to Mrs. Grant, but she trusted him. For the first time, she felt truly seen, as though all the hurt and injustice she had endured was finally being acknowledged. In the quiet confines of his office, Principal Johnson closed the door, creating a barrier between them and the rest of the school. Mrs. Grant stood before him, her expression a mix of defensiveness and fear. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some form of explanation, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "I've heard enough, Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What I want to understand is why you felt it was appropriate to treat any student, especially Aaliyah, with such disrespect." Mrs. Grant hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, she murmured, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. I was just trying to maintain discipline. Principal Johnson's expression hardened. Discipline? He repeated, his tone laced with incredulity. Discipline is one thing, Mrs. Grant. But the way you've spoken to Aaliyah, the way you've undermined her efforts and belittled her contributions, that goes beyond discipline. That's biased, plain and simple. The words hit her like a blow, the truth of them undeniable. She opened her mouth to protest, to defend herself, but the weight of his gaze held her silent. You may not have realized it, but your actions have left a lasting impact on Aaliyah, he continued, his voice softer now but no less firm. Do you have any idea how difficult it is for a young girl to feel that she has to prove her worth in the very place that's supposed to support her growth? You've created an environment where she felt small, where she doubted her abilities. Mrs. Grant's defenses crumbled, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. She had been so blinded by her own biases, so convinced of her own authority, that she had failed to see the harm she was causing. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to hurt her. I thought I was doing the right thing. Principal Johnson regarded her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. I appreciate your apology, he said, his tone measured. But words alone won't fix this. If you truly want to make things right, it starts with taking accountability and making a conscious effort to change. You owe that to Aaliyah, and to every student you have taught. He paused, letting his words sink in. This isn't just about one student, Mrs. Grant. It's about the responsibility you carry as a teacher, the influence you hold over young minds. If you can't rise to that responsibility, then maybe this isn't the right place for you. The gravity of his words settled over her, leaving her with a choice that was hers alone to make. The days that followed Principal Johnson's confrontation with Mrs. Grant left a quiet hum of tension across the school. Rumors spread quickly through the hallways, with snippets of conversations about what had happened and whispers of what might come next. Students who'd been in the classroom that day shared their stories with friends, and soon the whole school knew about the teacher who'd finally been called out. But behind all the rumors and talk, there was a steady, silent change in Mrs. Grant. She moved through her days with a heavy heart, the weight of her actions pressing down on her as she faced the consequences of her behavior. One afternoon she sat alone in the principal's office, the same space where she'd once felt so secure and respected. Now it felt different, unfamiliar, almost hostile, as if the walls themselves were witnesses to her missteps. Principal Johnson was calm but firm as he outlined the consequences she would face. Mrs. Grant, he began, his voice measured but carrying the weight of his authority. We've decided on a path forward, one that will give you a chance to reflect on your actions and, hopefully, to learn from them. You have two choices. You may choose to undergo training that will address issues of bias, respect, and inclusivity, training that will challenge you to confront your own behavior and make meaningful changes. Or, you can face more serious consequences, which may involve reassignment or even termination. Mrs. Grant looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously fidgeting as she absorbed his words. This wasn't the career path she'd imagined for herself. She had always thought of herself as a dedicated teacher, someone who guided her students toward success. But now, she was seeing herself through a different lens, one that revealed the harm she'd caused in the lives of those she was meant to nurture. After a moment, she looked up, her voice barely a whisper. I'll do the training, she said. There was a hint of humility in her tone, a small crack in the armor she'd worn for so long. She knew this wasn't a path to redemption, not yet, but it was a start. Principal Johnson nodded. Good, he replied, his expression softening ever so slightly. I hope you take this opportunity to reflect on your actions, not just for Aaliyah, but for every student you've taught and will teach in the future. The days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Grant attended each training session with a sense of obligation, but also with a growing awareness of the damage her biases had inflicted. She listened to stories from others who had faced discrimination, who had struggled against the silent, pervasive force of prejudice. Slowly, she began to understand the depth of her actions, and for the first time she felt genuine remorse, not just for the consequences she was facing, but for the pain she had caused. Meanwhile, Aaliyah found herself navigating a new landscape as well. There was a sense of relief, a lightness that came from knowing her struggles had finally been seen, that her pain had been acknowledged. Yet beneath that relief, there were layers of hurt and confusion, the kind that didn't simply fade away overnight. She walked through the hallways with her head held a little higher, a small but steady flame of confidence flickering within her. Her friends rallied around her, offering support and words of encouragement that helped to strengthen that flame. Maya, who had spoken up for her in class, became a close friend, and their shared experiences bonded them in ways Aaliyah hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, Aaliyah found herself sitting with Maya and a few other friends in the cafeteria. They were laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying the sense of camaraderie that had grown between them. For the first time in a long time, Aaliyah felt like she truly belonged, like she didn't have to hide any part of herself. As she looked around at her friends, she realized that this experience had given her something she hadn't expected, a sense of strength, a deeper understanding of who she was and what she deserved. She had faced adversity, and while it had been painful, it had also shaped her, helping her to see her own worth in a way she hadn't before. But the impact of what had happened extended beyond just Aaliyah and Mrs. Grant. News of the incident spread throughout the school community, sparking conversations among students, teachers, and even parents. It became a catalyst for change, a moment that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and respect within their own lives. In classrooms and hallways, students began discussing issues of inclusivity and fairness. Some teachers, inspired by the events, took it upon themselves to reflect on their own behaviors and to make their classroom spaces of genuine respect and equality. Principal Johnson organized workshops and discussions on the topic, encouraging both staff and students to engage in open, honest conversations about bias and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Aaliyah became somewhat of a symbol of resilience and courage, a figure who represented the strength it took to stand up against injustice. Her classmates looked up to her, admiring the way she had handled everything with grace and integrity. Even those who hadn't been close to her before felt a sense of connection, a shared understanding of the challenges she had faced. One evening, as Aaliyah was walking home from school, she felt a wave of emotions wash over her, a mixture of relief, pride, and lingering sadness. She thought back to all the moments when she'd felt small, invisible, like her voice didn't matter. But now, those moments were behind her, part of a journey that had ultimately led her to a place of strength and self-worth. Back in her office, Mrs. Grant continued to wrestle with her own feelings, grappling with the realization that her actions had caused real harm. She looked back on the lessons she had taught, the students she had mentored, and she wondered how many others had felt the same way Aaliyah had. Unseen, unheard, dismissed. Each day, as she attended her training sessions and reflected on her behavior, Mrs. Grant began to change little by little. She started to see her students not as names on a roster, but as individuals with unique strengths and challenges, each deserving of respect and encouragement. It was a slow, painful process, but she was committed to it, knowing that real change would not come easily. The school community, too, was evolving. Students felt empowered to speak up, to share their stories and support one another. Teachers began to foster a culture of inclusivity, one that celebrated diversity and recognized the value of each student. Principal Johnson's efforts to bring about these changes were met with enthusiasm and support, and the school began to transform into a place where everyone felt valued and respected. For Aaliyah, the journey was far from over. She still carried the scars of her experience, the moments of doubt and hurt that had shaped her along the way. But she also carried a newfound sense of resilience, a strength that came from knowing she had stood up for herself, that she had not allowed herself to be silenced. In time, Aaliyah and Mrs. Grant crossed paths again, their interactions marked by a quiet understanding. Mrs. Grant, now more reflective and aware of her actions, approached Aaliyah with a humility she had not shown before. "Aaliyah," she said softly, her voice tinged with sincerity. "I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I know I hurt you, and I can't undo what I've done. But I want you to know that I'm committed to being better, to treating all my students with the respect they deserve." Aaliyah looked at her teacher, a mixture of emotions passing through her. There was still a lingering hurt, a sense of betrayal that couldn't simply be erased. But there was also a sense of closure, a feeling that this chapter of her life was finally coming to an end. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I hope you do better, for yourself and for everyone else." With those words, Aaliyah walked away, her heart lighter, her spirit unburdened. She knew there would be other challenges ahead, other moments that would test her strength. But she also knew that she was capable of facing them, that she had the resilience and courage to stand up for herself and for what was right. And as the school year continued, the impact of her story resonated through the halls, a reminder to everyone of the power of respect, the importance of inclusivity, and the strength it took to confront one's own biases. The school was changing, one conversation at a time, and in the midst of it all, Aaliyah walked with her head held high, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The weeks that followed Mrs. Grant's apology brought a newfound clarity and strength to Aaliyah's life. She walked the hallways with her head a little higher, feeling the respect that had grown among her classmates and teachers alike. Her peers viewed her differently now, not just as another student, but as someone who had faced unfairness and stood up against it, inspiring others to do the same. In class, Aaliyah continued to excel, and her academic work flourished. With each project and assignment, she threw herself into her studies with a fresh confidence, realizing that her abilities could not be defined by anyone else's perceptions or limitations. Every time she raised her hand, she noticed the subtle but meaningful glances her classmates exchanged, an unspoken acknowledgement of her resilience, her quiet strength. They admired her not just for her academic skills, but for the courage it took to be her authentic self in a space that had once made her feel small. Her relationship with her father grew deeper as well. Principal Johnson, always a source of support, encouraged her to set new goals for herself. In their conversations over dinner, he listened to her dreams and aspirations with a respect that mirrored her own growth. There was a special bond between them now, a shared understanding of the challenges they had faced together, and a mutual commitment to fostering change within their school. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've been through a lot, Aaliyah," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "But you've handled it with grace and strength. You've shown everyone the kind of person you are." Aaliyah smiled, feeling the warmth of his words. She knew her father had always been her strongest supporter, but now, more than ever, she felt empowered to continue pushing forward, not only for herself but for everyone else who might face similar struggles. As the school year came to an end, the story of Aaliyah's journey left a lasting impression on the entire school community. Students and teachers began to speak openly about respect, fairness, and the importance of recognizing each other's unique strengths. The conversations that had once felt impossible became common, woven into the fabric of everyday life at school. Aaliyah became a quiet role model, her story a reminder of the resilience and strength within each person who chooses to stand up for themselves. Some students who had once felt overlooked found inspiration in her, seeing a reflection of their own potential in her success. She represented not only the power of self-belief, but the value of empathy, understanding, and forgiveness. In the closing days of the school year, Aaliyah took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. The pain and challenges she'd faced felt less heavy now, replaced by a sense of triumph and self-assurance that radiated from within. She'd shown that change was possible, that standing up to biases, even the subtle, hidden ones, could transform not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Her story served as a powerful reminder to her classmates, her teachers, and her community. She'd proven that facing one's struggles with courage and kindness could inspire others to do the same. As the final school bell rang, Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to continue on this journey, to grow and to learn, and to use her voice to make a difference. And as she walked out of the school, surrounded by friends and a supportive community, she knew she'd left a mark that would resonate far beyond her time there. Her strength had sparked a ripple of change, a reminder that addressing biases and building understanding could bring people closer and build a community rooted in respect and kindness. If this story of courage and loyalty inspired you, let us know by hitting that like button and sharing your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Aaliyah's shoes? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about bravery and the power of standing up for what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.